HanselMinutes.com. It's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman, hosted by Carl Franklin. This is Lawrence Ryan, announcing show number 68, recorded Thursday, June 14th, 2007. Support for Hansel Minutes is provided by Telerik RAD Controls, the most comprehensive suite of components for Windows Forms and ASP.NET web applications. Online at www.telerik.com. Support is also provided by /N Software Red Carpet Subscriptions, the most comprehensive solution for adding connectivity to your .NET and ASP.NET applications, with components for every major Internet protocol. Online at www.nsoftware.com. And by .NET Developers Journal, the world's leading .NET developer magazine. Online at www.sys-con.com. In this episode, Scott and Carl discuss Orcas, dynamic languages, and other topics with Patrick Cauldwell.
Hi, this is Carl Franklin. You're listening to Hansel Minutes from HanselMinutes.com. Scott is joining me this week with a special guest. Hi, Scott.
Hey, Carl. How's it going?
I'm doing fine.
You were shocked there because I asked you how you're doing, because that wastes the viewer's time. See, at this point on an ordinary podcast, I would ask you how your weekend was.
But we're not going to do that.
Here on Hansel Minutes, I don't care how your weekend was. I'm here with Patrick Cauldwell. Patrick Cauldwell is my right-hand man. He's my tattoo to my Mr. Rourke. He is he's the architect here on our next generation banking system.
Okay.
And we're going to be talking about Orcas, so we'll call this the Orcas Overview show.
Excellent. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks, Carl.
We talked a little bit about our original banking system here and how it's kind of a hybrid, and it's based on .NET 1.1, but there's some C++ in there. And Patrick is designing, along with a number of folks over here at Carillion, now a division of CheckFree, the next generation system. And it's going to be based on, I guess they're calling it now .NET 3.5. That's the official title.
Right.
And we're using a whole host of technologies within that. It's probably worth for a second demystifying the kind of mess that is the .NET Framework numbering system. I'm sure that you've had a little trouble with this yourself, right, Carl?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing about .NET 3.0 not really being a new framework, but just being additional features, sort of has thrown the whole... Well, it's what happens when marketing people get involved in naming decisions for versions of, that should normally be left up to the scientists.
Right, and then what is .NET 3.5?
Right.
Remembering that all of this is based on the 2.0 CLR.
Yeah.
And then Orcas is the code name for Visual Studio 2008 now.
Right.
So I feel that there's a lot of good stuff that's not being expressed because people are confused. People are not clear on exactly what is Orcas, what is 3.5, and they're kind of saying, well, what's the point? What is this next new thing? So at lunch today, I mentioned this to Patrick, and I said, what's the big deal? Orcas is what? And you said?
People have sort of been downplaying, well, LINQ, okay, great, it's data. I think that there's a lot more to LINQ than just the database part, and that some of the changes that they've had to make to the framework and to the compiler to support LINQ, I think will be a lot of huge value to us going forward without necessarily having direct bearing on data access.
So you see how Patrick went directly to LINQ on an Orcas question?
Well, I mean, that's the big news, right? I mean, LINQ is the major feature that we have in this new version of .NET, right?
It is it's the one that stands out, but I think there's a lot of the underpinnings in C# 3.0 that they had to change to make LINQ work that will end up being at least as important, if not more interesting, than the actual LINQ part.
Okay.
So how many different things are required to make this work? I mean, we all understand .NET 2.0. We understand the .NET CLR, the .NET 2.0 type system. We know that Visual Studio 2005 targets 2.0, that you can't target 1.1 without adding stuff to Visual Studio 2005. .NET 3.0 was really a series of libraries that augmented .NET 2.0, those libraries being the W*F stack, WPF, right. WCF, right? And then .NET 3.5 is still the .NET 2.0 CLR. It's a new Visual Studio and it is a new C# compiler and a new Visual Basic compiler. Is that right, Patrick?
Yeah, that is correct. And there's also been some additional library changes around the W*F stack. So there's some new Silver, which is the new integration between WCF and Windows Workflow, which also we're looking to take advantage of.
So has the base class library changed? Has my system.collections and those kind of things changed?
No, I mean, there are some additions, but the fundamentals haven't changed at all.
So there's been a versioning changes, but there's nothing like I'm going to find more things marked obsolete?
I don't think so. There may be some minor changes. I think there certainly are mostly going to be additions rather than any breaking changes. But that does bring up, though, I mean, it is additionally confusing the picture that when you look at the assembly versions on an Orcas system, some of the base class framework assemblies are still version 2.0, and some of them are 3.0, and now some of them will be 3.5. So it's really all, you're running this whole stack of things at different version levels.
But right now it seems like that's just an issue of the beta. I mean, ultimately the version numbers will all sync up. When I put this on a system, when I deploy to a system, what do they require? Like, I understand if I want to put .NET 2.0 on a system, I need to put the .NET 2.0 runtime. If I use WCF, WPF type libraries, I need to put the .NET 3.0 quote-unquote runtime. Not a very good word for it. The .NET 3.0 libraries. What do I need to do to take an Orcas application to a non-Orcas prepared system?
Then you'd have to install the 3.5, I guess, runtime or...
Is there one yet?
I don't know if there's a separate installer outside of Visual Studio 2008 right now, but I haven't looked.
So presumably there'll be a similar 3.5. And so now is it going to be do you know if it'll be a stack? I haven't figured this out. Like, can I get 3.5 by just running one installer, or do I have to go and do the dance of stacking installers?
Well, I think if 3.0 is a precedent, then 3.5 should be the same, and that you'll just run the one installer, and it'll install the 2.0 runtime and the 3.0 libraries, and then presumably any additional 3.5 stuff.
Okay. So back to the compiler thing, which I think is the most significant kind of part that people have trouble with, at least the people that I'm talking to, is the idea that there are two different C# compilers on an Orcas system. When you say file new within Visual Studio 2008, in that dialog box for a new project, there's an option in the upper right corner that says, which framework version do you want to target? And that sets the whole system up. That sets up your whole project for specific compilers, specific libraries, with which you'll get different syntax checking, different IntelliSense, completely different environment. So it's the first Visual Studio that lets you target more than one version of the framework in a supported way. When I say in a supported way, I mean that there's a thing called MSB, the Microsoft Build Everett environment, which let you target 1.1 under Visual Studio 2005, but it wasn't exactly a supported thing. It was more of kind of a fun thing that would give you a hybrid. But this is a formal change, it seems, on the part of the Visual Studio team to say, we will support all three of these targeted environments.
Yeah, I think it becomes a little easier, though, because since they're all targeting the same runtime, unlike with MSB stuff, you're really targeting a 2.0 or a 1.1 runtime. With this, you're targeting one CLR, right? There's only one 2.0 runtime. And so the switch is really just setting up which C# compiler am I going to use and which set of libraries am I referencing, right? Am I referencing the 2.0 version of system collections, or is it the 3.0 or the 3.5 version?
So really, and then this really kind of underscores the version numbering confusion. I mean, it's all .NET 2.0 with some different libraries.
And as just one more numbering confusion, the new compiler is called C# 3.0, which is coming out with the 3.5 runtime, and which didn't ship with the 3.0 runtime that included WCF and WPF, which makes sense if you view that independently, since it's a new ECMA spec. They went from a C# 2.0 to C# 3.0 is the name of the spec, but it didn't ship with 3.0, so that just adds one more point of confusion.
Yeah. I just like to think that with Orcas, it's next-gen C#, and that's kind of simple. That's a simpleton's kind of way of doing it, but it's how I deal with all the different version numbering. So what kind of improvements in C# have we been using so far? We see that, is it LINQ primarily?
LINQ and the stuff that surrounds it. So, I mean, the stuff that they enabled in the compiler to make LINQ work, like lambda expressions and like anonymous types and some of the new stuff that really went into the language to make LINQ work are interesting languages features, in and of themselves. So a couple weeks ago, you had a blog post about the Ruby syntax being more natural, where you could say 20.minutes.ago. Well, you can do that essentially exactly the same syntax using the new C# 3.0 compiler because of extension methods and that same sort of anonymous types, and facilitate a lot of that.
And Patrick, the DLR, the dynamic language runtime, this is not coming in the Orcas timeframe, right?
I believe that's true, yeah.
Yeah, and the thing that's interesting about the DLR is that it is a library, a series of libraries. So it's something that you could choose to redistribute and have them be private libraries, private assemblies to your application. So it's not necessarily something that you need to GAC. You don't necessarily make it a shared assembly.
Patrick, what about Visual Basic? You've been talking about C# 3.0 quite a bit. There are a few features in C# 2.0 that we would like to have had in VB, and the one that I keep coming back to is yield. Do you know anything about that? Are we finally getting yield in VB?
I think I saw something related to that, but honestly, I don't track the VB spec very well. So,
maybe you can explain what yield means to the C# programmer.
So yield was a new .NET 2.0, I guess, keyword that allows you to do very simple returning enumerators, right? So you can, in a loop, just say for each time through the loop, yield a return value of this, and the compiler will take care of turning that into something that is IEnumerable and returning a collection.
Yeah, and basically yield goes back to the caller and sends that item back to the caller as if it were part of a collection.
Right.
Very, very cool stuff.
Now, I wonder about this, and I'm just kind of like musing here. I don't necessarily have a conclusion, but I wonder to ask both you guys, for the average Joe, for the average programmer, these new features, how much of a mind shift does it take for these new features, for them to start using it? Are these the kind of language features where it's like, oh, there was a vacuum, I needed this, and now it's there when I need it? Or have we been using the existing language so long that we'll continue to forget that yield is there, forget that anonymous classes are there? There's kind of there's couple different kinds of programmers. I think that there's those that are clamoring for the new language features and are going to go, it could become so much more elegant now that I have this. And then there are those who will continue to forget that they're available and not use them at all. What do you think?
Scott, I think what you're going to see is just like we had with generics in 2.0, people really didn't know that they could do it any other way. And so we're perfectly happy coming down to the computer's level and programming without generics all these years. And generics show up and we start using them all over the place. And wow, finally, there's a whole lot of work that we don't have to do. That's good. And I think the same thing will happen with LINQ especially. That it'll open up new possibilities of the way that we can write code that, once we get over the learning curve and we start utilizing it a little bit more, we won't want to go back to doing things the old way.
Yeah, and there are some other new features in the C# 3.0 compiler that haven't been getting a lot of press because they aren't directly related to LINQ, but they've got some new stuff around object and collection initializers it's a much, much more compact syntax. So for example, when you do a new on a customer object, just like we've always had with attribute declarations, now I can say, new customer, open close paren, and then give a named list of parameters that I want to initialize. So you can, just like with the attribute syntax, I can say, new customer, open close paren, first name equals Joe, last name equals Smith, and have that in a very concise syntax as part of the object initializer, which is a new feature that has gone, rather overlooked, but it just makes the code that much cleaner. And similarly, there's a new collection initializer, so you can initialize anything that's IEnumerable the same way that you did with the previous C# array syntax.
So the new constructor syntax kind of obviates the need for 20 different overloaded kind of basic constructors whose only job it is to take a parameter and stick it into a member variable.
Right.
Yeah, let's face it, that's just busy work for most people, unless you actually need to hook those things in a different way in the constructor, which you do in the setters, but typically that's not a good idea anyway.
Right. So it's an example of, it's not a beautiful new language feature maybe, but it's that much closer to reducing the amount of code that monkeys could write that we have to take care of ourselves.
And after all, that's the goal, is to find ways to get monkeys to write code. That's the goal.
Ultimately, I think that we all wish that monkeys would write code. Now, the LINQ stuff, I know that it feels kind of strange when you start writing LINQ, D-LINQ, X-LINQ type code, because it's not in a string. We've spent so many years writing one language, be that VB or C#, and then tunneling other languages inside of strings. You know what I'm saying? You tunnel in regular expressions, you tunnel in XPath, you tunnel in SQL. These are all chunks of other languages that we kind of meta program and express in strings, and the compiler has no idea that those things exist. Every once in a while, someone will write a cool add-in that'll let you peek inside those strings and do some rudimentary syntax checking. When those quotes, those double quotes are removed, and suddenly those big green strings that used to be syntax highlighted as a string become a part of the language, it seems kind of creepy, at least to me. It seems kind of hard to get used to. How is the system aware of all that information? It seems like all this new knowledge that it knows about. It knows about the database. You're getting IntelliSense, right, Patrick, on tables. Where did it find out what table you were talking about? How did it know about this stuff?
So with objects, so the stuff that I've played around with most is the LINQ to object stuff, and there obviously the compiler's taking care of it. With the LINQ to SQL stuff, you do have to take the step of building some entities that the compiler will know about that look like your database. So it is a little strange, and the syntax has ended up being a little different than SQL. When you look at it, for example, you start with a for C in customers, and then the end of the statement says what you're actually selecting. So you do, for C in customers, where C is, name.fred, select C. So the syntax is a little different from SQL, which, I don't think is a huge problem. What that facilitates, though, is IntelliSense. So I think the first time somebody gets real IntelliSense over their set-based queries, they'll overlook the weirdness and embrace the new features.
And you don't have to regenerate these things. I mean, this is part of the system now, right? You don't have to go and say the database has changed. How does it? Do you have to do that?
I think that you would. I haven't tried it myself, but I think that you would have to go and regenerate those things if the database has changed.
Here at Carillion, we have a little bit different situation because our web servers don't talk directly to the database. We've got a true 3-tier and multi-layered system such that the web server talks to an application server, passing objects, data transfer objects back and forth, and then that application server talks directly to the database. So a lot of the work that we do is running around with objects, and we don't really know where they came from. We don't see that the database got involved. But I do know that in large systems like this, we spend a lot of time marshalling between type systems. We dance a lot between the SQL date time, XML date time, and the base class library date time. How does LINQ or D-LINQ deal with this constant marshalling of data between 3 different type systems? Right.
Well, my impression is, and again, I haven't spent a lot of time with the LINQ to SQL stuff, but that essentially all that's going to get normalized into CLR runtime types. So the underlying LINQ infrastructure is taking care of that stuff for you, so you can just worry about the C# constructs and not worry about the underlying data types.
So that makes the base class library kind of system.int, system.datetime, makes those the first among equals in this instance, because they're kind of the controller in this kind of triumvirate of data types. This relationship between the XML data types, the SQL data types. The base class library then becomes the first.
Yeah, and I think that's the way it should be, right? I mean, the average C# programmer doesn't need to know that there's any difference between a DB null and a null value for an object, right? I mean, that's just trivia. And again, we're back to the code that monkeys can write, right? Nobody wants to have to check every single value to see if it should be cast as a DB null instead of a null object. That's, it's just busy work.
In your work so far, have you felt that the code you're writing is less tedious? that kind of like repetitive stuff?
I think so, and I think that will, because of some of the new language features, that'll continue to be the case. And we want to, in the same way that we're starting to take more advantage of the underlying platform features, rather than writing some code ourselves, we want to spend less time doing busy work and more time writing banking software. And that, if every line of code that I don't have to tap out to cast something to DB null is time spent solving banking problems.
Yeah. That's definitely one of the things that we focus on here, is just trying to do things that are in our industry. In our case, we're in banking. In your case, whoever you are, dear listener, you might be in insurance or whatever. But, one of the first things that I ever did here at Carillion, like 6 years ago, is when we started doing .NET, is someone came up and asked me how to parse a date time. They were running around doing like an instir or something on a string to parse out the date time. And I was just really shocked, because it was like, don't you think someone has cracked the date time parsing problem? Could we move up a layer of abstraction? And we're constantly trying to build those layers of abstraction such that the system we are building on top of looks more like the business problem,
right,
and less like the tedium. I'd like to think about accounts and payees and payments rather than even thinking about date times and things like that.
Absolutely.
So hopefully that's the direction that things are heading. Is there a sense that C# 3.0 is more dynamic? Because there's a sense that Visual Basic 10, VBX, VB10, it's like OS X, VBX. Visual Basic 10 is kind of reinventing itself, or not reinventing itself, but let's say reasserting its heritage as a dynamic language. I know that you can do type inference in C# 3.0, but type inference does not a dynamic language make.
I think when you put together things like extension methods, anonymous types, and the type inference, the new var data type, you get a lot closer to being a dynamic language without... it's obviously not as clean a syntax, right? So you're not going to have necessarily the syntactic goodness of something like Ruby, but you'll have a lot of those same features. So it may not look quite the same, but the language does facilitate more of that dynamic behavior.
Looking at things from a larger, more historical scope, looking back, is if you think about the last 30, 40 years of programming and how the dynamic language wonks kind of say that it's a resurgence of dynamic languages, is there a sense that maybe we never left and this whole kind of C thing was just a quick jaunt off into a dead end or a cul-de-sac, and oops, didn't really mean to be that static. Let's head back to Lisp. Let's all be Lispy again.
It's kind of a religious issue, but I'm a statically typed language fan myself. I'm still not totally bought off on the whole dynamic types thing. So, the fact that we can facilitate the programming model we want and come closer to expressing coder intent in our C# 3.0 code and still get the benefits of compile time type checking, that's where I'd like to see it go. I'm still a little nervous about, dynamic types and some of the less strongly typed stuff. So it's nice to, and I think a lot of the proponents of dynamic languages, what they really want is, I want my code to express my intent without having to write a bunch of other junk in the middle.
Exactly.
If we can get closer to that and still have compile time type checking, that makes me happy.
Now, when you say compile time type checking, we did a little bit of a talk on dynamic languages a couple of shows ago. Someone wrote in and mentioned that there was a thing, I thought it was called auto test. I might be getting this wrong. Someone can correct me. But basically, it was a Ruby test engine that would constantly run your application. So basically, if you think about what compile time type checking is doing, right? It's doing an almost run to make sure that things are cool, because ultimately you don't know how this thing runs until it runs. So a dynamic environment could make up for not having compile time type checking by using those background cycles to simply have the thing run constantly.
Well, we have
forever.
that in Visual Basic. It's called the background compiler.
Right, and it breaks down, at some point, whether it be 1,000 project. Somebody always comes up with an email and they'll say, hey, I have 1,000 projects into one solution and background compilation is slow on my system. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's going to be the case no matter what kind of background checking you have if you've got that many.
At some point, size becomes a problem. But you're absolutely right. That is probably one of the things that's going to allow Visual Basic 10 to begin to succeed as a dynamic language because they're going to give people that sense up front.
I would also add, Scott, that those 1,000 project solutions are very rare, and that most development is done within the scope of something that the background compiler can handle very well.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's true. I was just bringing that up as an edge case.
That's true.
But I think it's interesting to look at the idea of, well, let's run it all the time and keep it running and make up for anything that might be gained by an upfront compilation.
I tell you, that's one of the reasons that I haven't, fully gone over to C# yet, is because that background compiler is wonderful. And, you use that for a while, and it's damn nice, It's...
And the religious arguments continue. I think that's probably a good place to start. Let's see if we can get Anders to come on the show and tell us what direction he's taking C# 4.0.
No, it's not a big religion thing. The religious wars are over. It's just a matter of what works best for the job, and what the trade-offs are already there. Everybody knows the issues. It's not.
Yeah,
religion.
ultimately, we just want to do good work, get our jobs done, and write in a language that makes us feel good.
Exactly.
Pick the shoe that fits. Cool. Well, thanks, Patrick, for taking the time out of your lunch hour to come in and do a show with me. And that's our show for today, I think, Carl.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Scott. And thank you for listening. And we'll see you next week on Hansel Minutes.